Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. I'm Shri Iyer. I'm one of the founders of gamebench, and we've been running this series for the last year now. I am really excited to host our final installment for the CS Performance Matters series. If you missed our previous webinars, please go to www.gamebench.net/events and check them out. They are casual, they're fun to watch, and if you're bored over the weekend, I think it'll be a good thing to spend time on. I would like to start by saying that thank you all for joining us today. In our webinar so far, we focused on key challenges across game development, cloud gaming, and the impact of 5G on the changing roles and strategies of network operators. But we haven't yet spoken about the fact that investments in M&A in gaming and game tech have been on a high since 2020. Year to date, games industry investments are more than 2.5 times higher than they were at this point in 2020. More than 1,000 deals, I'm sure there are more at the moment, were announced and closed in this period, as lockdowns confirmed that gaming was not only very much alive, but thriving through the pandemic. Chou of Kabam recently spoke of massive levels of investment coming into the industry, claiming that it's a great time to be an entrepreneur, a publisher, a gaming partner, or an investor. So to wrap up 2021, we now take a peek into the future through the eyes of a few investors and founders here. And we will talk about, at least to some extent, about the top gaming trends in 2020 and 21 that attracted investment and why. The metaverse, of course, a popular subject, doesn't even know exactly what it means. We'll try to get to that. Is our future fully digital? The concept, which could be more than a decade away from being fully realized, will take the cooperation among the biggest industry players here, like Meta, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Epic. But it'll also need the likes of Unity with the recent acquisition of Weta Digital, and Roblox, of course, where people can come together within millions of 3D experiences to learn, work, play, create, and socialize. What's also interesting is that recently Nike and Ralph Lauren are all willing to invest in this idea too. Back to the real world, it seems revenue is still concentrated among the top 100 publishers. Is a different model for game publishing needed in this industry? Will mobile gaming continue to dominate the PC market through 2022 and beyond? And on the network-centric gaming side of things, as 3G was to Spotify, 4G for Netflix, will 5G be the driving force for cloud gaming? Will there be convergence in gaming, cloud, social coming together? And what about AR, VR gaming? So plenty of questions, plenty of areas to invest in, and lots and lots of opportunities here. Will this pace of investment accelerate? And if so, in which directions? With that sort of scene set, I would like to hand this over to the panelists we have today. We have assembled a handful of industry experts and one entrepreneur for this panel. And I'm going to hand this over to them. We have Alec Daffner, for partner at GP Bullhound, Manny Ingersoll from 10110 Ventures, Elena Marcus from AGC Partners, Abby Albright from WRX Fund, and our entrepreneur for the panel, Chase Trio from Op Games. On that note, I'll hand this over with one opening question to all of you, which is a common one. Is first of all, the introduction, so our audience can get to know you a bit better, is basically what trends do you see driving up this investment just in the recent past and going forward? And is there a framework you use to assess compelling game industry investments, and what attracts you to them? So on that note, let me start with Alec, and I can go in that order.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe start with brief introduction. So I head up the San Francisco office for GP Bullhound. Actually started the office for the firm back in 2008, so my 14th year with the firm. I've been doing tech banking in the San Francisco Bay Area for the last 23 years. Bullhound is a merchant bank focused on the technology sector, so we really focus around two areas. One is we advise companies on mergers and acquisitions, and we also have an investment fund. And we've been very active in the game sector historically. So some of the clients that we've advised on M&A situations or capital raising include Games, Playdemic, Splash Damage, King Digital Entertainment, Sumo Digital, et cetera, et cetera. And then our investment fund has also made quite a few of investments in the space, including Unity, Discord, Quixel, Challenger Mode, and Resolution Games. So we have a unique perspective on the space because we're both advising companies on transactions, but also making investments. I think from my perspective and from the investment team's perspective at Bullhound, there's a number of kind of key factors driving investments in the space. I think one that we've seen in the last few months is the merging of the metaverse with kind of social media and then gaming, right? So bringing that all together, obviously with Facebook changing its name to Meta and making more of an aggressive move. I think the other thing that we have seen is private equity and growth equity. Traditionally, if you go back 10 years, historically could not get comfortable investing in, or in many cases were not comfortable investing in more hit-driven businesses, so developers or publishers, where there was a hit-driven cycle, very difficult for a financial investor to determine what's going to be a hit and what's not. And so historically, that a lot of the financial investors focused on more kind of tools and tech and engines that were macro plays on the space. But I think with the success of many of game publishers, particularly around mobile, it's brought a lot more private equity, growth equity, and venture capital into the space. And then the other thing is just there's a ton of dry powder right now across the board from the investment community looking to deploy into really interesting companies. So I would say those are kind of the three things from my standpoint.
Alec, the second part of the question was: is there a framework you use to assess compelling investments today? What do you look for? I mean, given that you have set the scene for how you look at the market.
Yeah, I think the one thing that's interesting is obviously, and this is at a later stage, right? And so if you're dealing with startups, that don't have a lot of kind of financial track record, that's going to be more like KPI based and like user metrics, things like that. Once you start to get into more of like growth stage companies, it becomes, we assess and many of the kind of the buyer universe assess value based on, financial metrics. And so, those would be obviously revenue and then metrics of profitability. We've sold a couple companies to Unity. We've sold a couple companies to Epic in the last couple years. Most of those businesses, were not profitable or were kind of break even, and so those tended to be valued more on revenue multiples, very similar to what you see kind of in the SaaS space. And then there's the value of, like with Quixel, with their Megascan technology and kind of the database of development kind of graphics that they had built, like, what is the value of that to Epic? And they've kind of bundled that in as one of the key kind of components of the latest version of the Unreal Engine. And so, for them, there was some financial components to that, but it was really more the value of the Megascan database and the value of kind of the technology and what the team could do as part of Unreal Engine.
Got it. Thanks for that, Alec, for that detailed answer. I'm going to move to Minnie, who again represents 10-1-10 Ventures. So Minnie, over to you.
Great. So thanks so much. I'm Minnie, partner at 10-1-10. 10-1-10, we're a seed stage fund here in LA. We tend to lead seed rounds. What that means nowadays is probably someone who's raising $3 or $4 million. And gaming is one of our core focus areas, mostly led by my partner, Eitan Elbaz. He was one of the co-founders of Scopely, and actually just launched a new NFT gaming, NFT focused company, really focused on musicians, called Afterparty. But we also have a large partnership with NCSoft that is part of that gaming focus that we have. And the sorts of companies that we tend to invest in tend to be more technology companies. And so there's a lot of tech that's being developed for gaming that is really cutting edge and exciting. We tend to do less, I think we call it gaming infrastructure, more than sort of the IP or the content sort of investing. And to your second question around trends, I would echo a lot of what Alex said, but for us, it's looking at things like Unity. If you go to Unity's homepage, I think right now, they're advertising their use in construction. I've seen them in aerospace or in, prior to doing venture capital, I was in used car sales, started a used car company. And there's interesting use case of actually, there's a Unity use case for sort of the full 360-degree view of selling used cars, in fact. So there's a lot of technology, not just Unity, I'm just sort of picking on them, but around cloud gaming streaming that's really cutting edge, because what you can do, obviously delivering movies with around, compression and latency is not possible when you're, talking about real-time games. You can't use those same codecs. You can't have more than a few, tens of milliseconds of latency. So that's really pushing the boundaries that we find exciting. And to pick up on Alex's point about the metaverse, I think, that's certainly a huge piece of it is, half the kids in the United States, more than that, are playing Roblox right now. And they're not going to go from a 3D world into a 2D world again, right? They're not going to say, oh, great, let me go back to looking at these two-dimensional feeds. They've grown up in this three-dimensional world. I heard a pitch, I'm going to butcher it, but essentially he started the pitch by saying something like, in the future, 90% of our friends are going to be people we haven't met in real life. And whether or not you exactly agree with that, it is changing the way we think about our identity, who we are, who our friends are, how we think about ownership. And I think investment dollars are going to follow eyeballs and interest. And so if Roblox has almost 50 million daily active users and 70% of them are kids or under the age of 15 or 16 or something, that the investment is going to follow that. And so that those are some of the trends that we find exciting. Do you want me to also tackle the third part of your question, which I could go on a lot about, what we're looking for in pitches, because that's kind of my daily activity.
Hold on to that thought, Minnie. Hold on to that thought.
Okay, great.
I think I'm going to unpack something you said and move to Elena,
Sure.
because you made the point about gaming infrastructure and game tech. And Elena, when I spoke to you, you actually spoke a lot about the game tech versus gaming. So I'll pass the baton to you to sort of introduce and dive straight in.
Perfect. Thanks, Sri. Great to be here, and thanks for putting this great panel together. Elena Marcus, AGC Partners. We're an investment bank. I am heading the LA office, and we focus on technology M&A private placements. I love the gaming, and specifically the gaming tech space, and that's where I've been spending most of my time in the last 7 years. And why is gaming tech interesting to me? Obviously, some of the most talented developers and some of the most exciting innovation is created in gaming. And the beauty is that a lot of that is starting to get applications across all kinds of sectors, like Minnie talked about, I think used car sales, or architecture, e-commerce, and the last couple of years living through the COVID times, a lot of these trends have really accelerated, and there's this need for really immersive experiences, and gaming technologies enable those through all industries. And the most successful transactions we've worked on are technology companies that have started in gaming and have found a lot of traction in other verticals, automotive, furniture, you name it. How do I decide who do I work with, or what client is exciting for us? If it's on the earliest stage, kind of where some of the things that Alec pointed out, do they have technology that's really differentiated? Is the team, top-notch experts and passionate and have built something that's really core and will be exciting for a lot of these Unity Apex of the world, Microsoft, Googles? Or is it a company that already has great traction and great customers across all kinds of verticals, and there we have other metrics that we can go off. So I'll pause here.
Thanks for that, Elena. I'm going to pass this on to Abby at this stage from the WRXM. Abby, you have the mic now.
Sure. So Abby Albright, I am one of the co-founders of WXR Fund, which originally stood and still does stand for Women in XR. So we started out as sort of an accelerator supporting female founders in pre-seed AR, VR startups. And then we evolved to forming a formal fund, and we expanded that thesis to the AR, VR, and AI. And essentially what we say is spatial computing, and that's the intersection in which we play. And it's still female-founded companies at the pre-seed and seed stage. Additionally, I have been working at Activision Blizzard in various capacities. I have been a product manager on Call of Duty, and then on the corporate strategy team, and more recently, a new product manager on new games at Blizzard. And I believe the first question is sort of what are the typical things that we are looking at? And so one of the things that I think, personally, I do angel investments outside of our fund, and I'm open to a little riskier type of investment. So I consider content-related investments to be of that group. And I think that's not a very controversial statement. Most people believe that it's still hits driven. Content is really challenging for startups to do. And there are a lot of people that believe that if you want to make $1 million starting a game company, then start with $10 million. And I think that that's predominantly true, but I believe where I'm most interested is in some of the newer sort of areas and arenas. So for example, I've backed a gaming company that's aiming to incorporate some NFT elements and play to earn. That being said, obviously highly risky, and there's unclear sustainability on play to earn as a model, and we can look to Axie just to prove that out. But in general, I think that gaming content is something that I tend to do on my own. I'm also looking at platforms and tools. So an ideal investment would be something like either Fractal or platforms like Mythic Games, where Blankos is just a demo game, but can do well in and of itself. And then as a fund, we, given our roots in spatial computing and at the intersection of AR and VR, we've been really trying to focus on things that have a path to market that's not limited to wearables distribution, which I think is a very challenging thing today. There's estimates of how many headsets, but it's in the millions and tens of millions, I think. But that being said, that's one thing that was been challenging for us. But as our thesis has been at AR, VR, and AI. But we believe that it's coming, but we needed to just make investments in companies that can survive in a 2D world. So there's a great investment that we've made called Obsess VR, or Obsess VR originally, just Obsess now, and they are focused on the future of e-commerce, and they can live both in a 2D screen, but also in a 3D world through a headset, and they are not reliant on that. So I would say for our fund, most investments are not gaming related to date, but we have made an investment in an interactive gaming platform that had roots in VR. But so those are the big caveats, I should say.
Great. Abby, thanks for that intro and that answer. And I think I'm going to pick on one thing you said, slightly risky play to earn models. And on that note, I'm going to pass this on to Chase, who's investing in that risky model in some way. So
Yeah.
Chase, you have the mic, and that will be great at this point because you've spoken so much about the metaverse, NFT, and almost, I think 3 out of 4 panelists mentioned NFT gaming. It'd be great to understand from you, besides the intro, is unpack this a little bit for us, the old school publishing world and what Op Games is trying to do with an NFT game. That'd be great for us to hear.
Definitely. Good morning, evening, everyone, to whoever's watching. My name is Chase. I'm the CEO and co-founder of OP Games. I've been in the gaming space for the last, I'd say, 12 years now, just right before the height of the free-to-play revolution back in 2010, 2011. So in a way, I've seen different types of models come up in terms of different types of inflection points in the trends in gaming in general. I've been doing a lot of games publishing in the past, mostly investing in games and basically publishing them in our own platform. Most of these experiences were actually based off in China, which is kind of like a different animal altogether, as opposed to gaming in general in the Western world or the rest of the world in general. In terms of how I got into NFTs and blockchain, that started off back in 2017, super early at the time. That was my first venture into entrepreneurship, and we were building picks and shovels for NFTs in general, NFT creator, marketplace builders during the time where nobody's heard of NFTs. I think like only 25 people are actually building stuff on the NFT space, and I guess it's a really smart thing to do, to build something for nobody at that point. And so it took us about 3 years to really refine exactly the stuff that we're doing at OP Games, and kind of right now, 2021 is the culmination of that, especially with NFT becoming a huge buzzword this year. And OP Games in general is 2 things. Like, number one is we're basically building tooling solutions for game developers to actually move from Web 2 to Web 3, as we call it. So these are different types of SDKs, which we call the game Legos, that essentially could adapt to different types of models of games that could potentially want to be involved in the Web3 environment. The next step that we're building as well is a platform, which essentially is a curation of all of the games that we bring in as well, mostly Web2 games, going into Web3 with some play-to-earn elements attached into it. So you can liken that to, I would say, Steam or itch.io, for example, where most independent game developers and creators can actually come in and create games that they can potentially monetize. With all of this metaverse slash NFT talks, just sort of like pivoted that a little bit. Essentially, the hope there in the very, very beginning of the movement was that, at the very least, at a personal standpoint, I moved from publishing to blockchain, specifically for the reason of inclusiveness, of like how developers slash players can become part of the ecosystem. We know that Web2 in general, specifically games, it's fairly extractive, right? Like, especially free to play, wherein there's a lot of microtransactions involved. You have to pay for you to be able to actually get involved in different types of gameplays available in the game. And we thought that, having NFTs, having blockchain as part of that ecosystem that sort of like creates games would allow players to become more involved in the financial incentives that's aligned to the game itself, as opposed to me paying and just getting back fun, so to speak. So it changes the way we look at games in general. It changed the way we think of like how we can get employed in general, because metaverse provides that digital sort of like kind of like universe that allows us to actually get involved wherever we may be. And whether or not we're playing for fun or we're playing because there's a financial incentive aligned to it, it really caters to these types of different types of players. And that's kind of like where NFT is coming from. I think that in the beginning, we were thinking of like, oh, okay, number one, it could potentially become interoperable. My items from game number 1 can be played in game number 2 if game number 1 shuts down. that was at least my early thesis back in 2017, wherein I was sort of like talking to NFT conventions here and there. And the thought process was, okay, NFTs are immutable. They're on the blockchain. You have perpetual ownership of the NFT, unless, of course, you transfer it to somebody else. It's on the blockchain, so nobody can shut it down, unless the internet shuts down. And unlike centralized games, wherein you buy assets that you don't really own at the end of the day, because it's in an AWS server, for example, which once the game shuts down, you don't have access to those assets anymore. So we thought, okay, we could go ahead and have these assets transfer over from one game to another. But then, moving forward, 2019, 2020 is like when, standards are not there. Like one game could potentially not accept another one's NFTs if they don't want to. And so there's definitely still a lot of movement that needs to be sort of like created in order for us to be able to get there. And I think you're right. I think in 10 years time, 5-10 years time is when we're likely going to see some really massive shift on the metaverse side of things. But the groundwork is being laid right now. And I think that it's more favorable to creators, at least with the NFT side of things. And we're talking about creators. We're not just talking about content creators. We're also talking about developers in general that are basically creating interactive games. And I think that's kind of like where the NFTs and the metaverse would eventually become really, really valuable for these types of creators or entrepreneurs in general.
Thank you very much for that short intro. That was very useful. I've learned a lot in just the 2 minutes that you spoke about. One thing that I would like to ask you, Chase, is, talking about NFTs, it is new. It is still questionable in some ways, in some sort of corners of the ecosystem, where it's risky in some ways. Has it been difficult for you to communicate the value prop to investors, where investors are used to more traditional ways of gaming, and some of them are not used to? I mean, gaming itself is new to certain investors. So how have you managed that, overcome that hill? Was that a hard hill to climb?
Yeah, it's definitely really hard, especially in the very beginning. I think now it's much easier, and quite honestly, it's probably because there's a lot of FOMO happening right now on the GameFi movement. 2020 is when, for some odd reason, I didn't have to really heavily pitch, and investors are like, okay, take my money, let me in, right? Which I find odd, quite honestly, because like that only means that it's sometimes like people would like say, oh great, you've raised money, but actually it's because the market is actually sort of like moving investors into that space. But quite honestly, I think in terms of like how I communicate things with investors, especially those who's been in the Web2 space on the gaming side of things, is how things are really different in terms of like how game creators are actually going to be able to actually manage how they make games. For example, when you invest in games in the Web2 space, whether it's a casual or hyper casual or mid-core games, even as a publisher, we typically have to spend millions of dollars because it's always a numbers game. As a game publisher, we look into one casual game or hyper casual game, test them out on Facebook, see what the CPI is, and if it's low enough for us to actually create massive acquisition of users, then it's a good game to publish. Just because we can basically at the very least monetize 2% of that huge amount of audience that we have. With play to earn or with games on the blockchain or crypto, that's completely irrelevant. So a lot of the games that are not really succeeding on Web2 can potentially move into Web3 just because of the fact that their relevance on Web2 really depends on how much users, on what price we can actually acquire to actually let them play the game. But with Web3, since everybody is leading with their wallets, we don't necessarily have to build a $1 million acquisition campaign for users, because we can basically tap into communities after communities and actually have these games sort of like within their radar. So that's kind of like a difference there. And so there's a different way of like how we can actually create value for the game. And that's obviously what Abby mentioned a while ago, wherein like it's like, when she mentioned Axie Infinity, for example, on the play to earn side of things, on the sustainability side of things, that's not just like a one game endeavor, but rather as an industry as a whole, how do we actually create a level of sustainability that investors themselves would have some level of confidence that this will endure right, in the next 5 years, 10 years, or even further. And yeah, that's kind of like where the challenge is right now. And I think when communicating that to investors, that's kind of like where do we have this utmost belief that this will be surmounted in a certain period of time, or do we think it's a trend or a fad that at some point will fizzle out? And you know, the answer to that is, for me, it's not a fad, it's not a trend. It will eventually reach, you know, much greater heights, but obviously we do have different ways of like looking at it on different perspectives as well.
Thanks for that, Chase. One point that there's clearly technology drivers behind the NFT growth, and I think I'd love to sort of ask that question to the panel, saying what is happening in the technology world that is driving up the growth of, or the adoption to some extent of NFT/blockchain, and blockchain is becoming more popular. So I would love to ask that question. But before that point, I had one question for Alec. When we were speaking last week, we were discussed, how you look at profitability versus revenue in the gaming world, whether you're a publishing company or a tech company. And this thing about NFT gaming, I feel sits somewhere in the middle. So it'd be great to hear from you. How do you value companies in terms of profitability versus revenue? How would you sort of balance that, and where would you possibly place an NFT gaming company in this ecosystem?
Yeah, great questions. I think it slightly depends on the stage of the business, right? In terms of how, what metrics you're going to look to value a business. Earlier stage businesses generally aren't going to have profits, so naturally the next kind of financial metric that you would look at to judge kind of the success of the business or the momentum of the business would be revenues. And as you continue to grow, both revenue and profitability become much more, I think equally important. If we look at like where a lot of on the advisory side of the business, where we've sold some of the kind of larger mobile game publishers and developers, those generally are going to trade on EBITDA metrics, right? So metrics of profitability, and those can be, in the teens. Multiples have gone up. I think in the last, several years. I mean, it used to be, the King Digital acquisition by Activision was like 7 times. And we're seeing, deals done in the market now in the mid-teens to high teens EBITDA multiples. So there's been multiple creep, partly because of just the overall growth in the space. But on the earlier stage side, it's really what you're trying to do. We look at this from our investment team is, how do you judge the success of a business? What are the KPIs underlying those revenues? So it's not just like, hey, what is the revenues, but what are the key drivers of that growth, whether that's, user growth or some other metric. And it depends. So like, with Delta DNA, which is business we sold to Unity, it was the technology. It was also like the revenues, which was a metric of financial success, but also the number of users and the number of game publishers that were actually using their technology. And I guess the last point, question is like in the NFT space. I mean, it's an area that honestly we've been looking into, both from our investment team and the advisory side of our businesses. I think today it's very nascent, so I don't think we've necessarily taken a really firm view on that, but would love to kind of hear from the rest of the panelists if they have a particular view on that.
Great, thanks for that, Alec. I'll pass this on to Elena, Abby, and Minnie. How would you weigh these type of businesses, and where would you sort of fit an NFT like business in this sort of value chain?
Maybe Minnie, if you don't, I can just jump in, just filling a little bit on kind of what Alec already spoke about. We do see, I mean, in our experience, especially on the game tech side, you do have this, very venture backable companies that have this amazing technology, but it's a very classical case of a group of PhDs or super talented engineers. They got together and put together a phenomenal platform, but sometimes they just want to build tech and they don't care about monetizing. So that's totally okay. Or sometimes, they just lack the right team to help them. And we have these strategics that are always on the lookout and picking out these great teams and great techs very early on. And then on the flip side, you have the private equity firms that are looking for these really companies with more proof points and traction to go and put together these big platforms or roll-ups and the likes. And in the game tech space, unlike other tech verticals, you don't have a litter or like a huge number of those. There's probably, you can count them, on your hands how many of those could be a potential platform candidate. So it creates an interesting opportunity. We've seen more and more interest from the private equity communities as the space is gaining more traction. And with the 3D space, picking up this really accelerated pace, hopefully we get to see more of these venture-ish companies actually graduating to this private equity level and getting some more actually, private equity-backed companies. But Minnie, over to you.
Sure. I'll echo points made. I think what Alec was saying about, you can look at traditional metrics nowadays. We're not talking about, I think that mantra of it's a hit-driven business has changed. And I heard someone say, gaming is the new SaaS, which may not exactly be true, but it's not just looking at, we're not looking at EBITDA multiples. I'm an early stage investor, but it's not just revenue or user growth. We're looking at cohort analysis. We're looking at retention. We're looking at engagement metrics are extremely important. And then similar to a SaaS business, we're looking at CAC, LTV, all the sort of KPIs that Alec was referencing. You used to think that gaming was somehow a different beast to evaluate, but in truth, all those same sorts of cohort analyses and CAC to LTV ratios still apply. The other thing that Elena said there was, about the tech, because obviously we look at the tech. And in fact, one of our, when we pass on companies, there's like a reason passed field, and there's a drop down and there's like a free text field. And so one of our shorthand things is hammer looking for nail. And hammer looking for nail is actually a very frequent reason we pass, which is, this is the most awesome holographic, light field, something tech coming out of university, and it's a hammer. And then they say, well, there's like 8 different use cases that this could be applied to. And usually if there's 8 different use cases, that means the opposite of what we're looking for, right? The opposite of means there isn't one area where we are deep in, we know the user need, there's being pull from the users. So that's one of the big things we look for in investment is the founders who know who their target audience is and understand that. I'll riff a little on the NFT space. Chase, you could riff more on it, but we saw a pitch that was a very profitable, someone who previous company had developed a very profitable game. And maybe this isn't quite NFT, this is sort of Web3 more generally, but very profitable game. And he described it as something like, I have the world's most profitable McDonald's built on top of a volcano. Okay, I'm mangling this a little bit, but essentially I'm built on platforms that are the big tech giants today. You're built, let's say, going back, you're Zynga built on top of Facebook or something, it's an unstable foundation. And so I think that's some of the promise of what people in today's world, in the Web3 world, are looking at, which is it's a stable, a stable platform not controlled by some entity that you're sort of some volcano. That's what I'm trying to say.
Nice to meet you. Abby, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's fair, what Minnie mentioned. I think the one thing I would say about like the hits-driven business part of some of this is that I believe App Annie, well, this is for mobile apps and mobile games, but App Annie had some data around sort of supporting the fact that it is easier to get to 1 million downloads, for example, than ever before. It's like more people are doing it, and in a faster time, given just how much access we all have to internet. However, to break into the top like 10 games, for example, is even more challenging, and the ones that are still there are, have been around for 5+ years, or maybe, there's a couple that are new. Of course, you can break through, but there is like staying power from the IP and just the fact that they were earlier in the market cycle. So I think that that's where like some of that, maybe within mobile gaming, for example, then that's just the case, is still in some ways hits driven, but obviously that's not the case for all areas.
Cool. Thanks for those answers. I'm gonna move on to something slightly different now, and see if I can focus less on NFT. I think we've actually hashed it out quite a bit. Roblox has been a phenomenon recently, and Abby, and sorry, Minnie, you made a point about the Roblox economy. Where do you see the growth of Roblox-like platforms going forward, given that there's an aspect of social, and the engagement model is quite different, and you feel that you're part of a big platform? Do you see Roblox-like platforms playing a bigger role going into the future? Minnie, I'll start with you, because I think you did make the point a while ago.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of something kind of where I could make a different point. What would be interesting there? So if someone wants to jump in. Yes, I mean, I see it as I see it as where children, where we're all going to be hanging out eventually, right? Like that's sort of what they, as they grow up, they're not going to go back to the 2D experience. And it's, I think things like, I'll elaborate. I think things like ownership I mentioned, right? So some of the interesting thing there is, we're seeing people take pride in what they own, what they have created in these metaverses in a way that we didn't used to, right? Like we used to have to go buy an actual house. And I think that behavior is a fundamental shift, and that plays with this whole discussion around NFTs, what we own property in these places, or the youth do, at least. They own property, they have a sense of who their identity is. I mean, we talk so much about, the changing, almost like gender identities, all of this, but you can create your own identity, you have multiple identities, all of that is a fascinating way of the future. I don't think it's by any means going to change. Although I'd actually pick on Chase a little bit, which is how ownership looks different and how games will be developed very differently. Like right now, there's no incremental cost for me to, as a publisher, to make new skins or something. I can give everyone, and yet with NFTs, there is incremental cost. So I think, yes, Roblox is here to stay, but actually the fundamental paradigm of that ownership, games will have to be developed differently. And
Definitely. Like, I mean, like, like in the past, like we've tried sort of like dressing up games with Web3 elements that sort of like already has a core loop that is very centralized in nature. And the way it worked is it just became like a PR vehicle for that game, but not necessarily change the way it monetizes its game itself. It still relies on in-app purchases. It's still the same model in terms of like how it actually provides value for its players, which is essentially selling skins that are basically infinite in number. And that's kind of like where developers would have to really rethink like a huge paradigm shift in terms of like how they would start building their games, because there's this financial economic loop that's already embedded as well within a play to earn paradigm. And this is kind of what's concerning right now as well on the play to earn sphere at the moment, is that there's a lot of games right now that are actually, okay, well, let me just try to add some tokens and create a play to earn element into my game. But the truth of the matter is, Axie Infinity, for example, we started out together back in 2017. At that time, it was a very early project. And they've really harnessed how they can create like this huge financial stack on top of a game, so that players are incentivized properly into the ecosystem, which probably is much harder than creating the game itself. And for that reason, there could be this sort of like effect for other games in general that are just basically trying to reskin the game, trying to like basically add play to earn elements into it, because you have to build a game from the ground up for you to be able to actually create a really robust game with these financial incentives involved with these players. So you're definitely right. It has to change somehow, because developers are used to this, creating multiple assets or infinite amount of assets that they can sell and they can turn into players all the time. But with NFTs coming into play, you have to think about scarcity. You have to think about like how you can actually create value around the NFT, and that's kind of like where the mindset has to change as well for regular game developers, especially that they're used to the Web2 model of just basically creating the skins and assets and really not putting a lot of like mind on scarcity and rarity, as it actually translates into how scarcity and rarity is in real life. So I think it takes a lot of adjustment, and I think games will be built differently. A lot of people are like saying now, hey, it's play to earn. That means that it's not going to be fun anymore because I'm basically working, right? And some people may probably think that way, but in a way, like earning money is not that bad. I mean, for some people or for most people, it's fun, right? And I'm having fun at work, so I guess like that's completely fine as well. But there's definitely going to be like different types of mind shifts involved, not just on the developer side, but also on the player side of things. Like, how do you derive fun in a game? Because before, it's fairly straightforward. It's entertainment value. Like, how does it distract me? How does it take away my time? But this time around, there's a lot of elements involved into it. I have to be strategic in terms of playing that, because it involves limited resources that would also come out from myself, which I could lose or I could gain, depending on how I play. So it's a really different model that I think that we're just really getting started. It's very nascent, but definitely in the right direction.
Chase and Minute, thank you for that. I did want to sort of bring a new topic in, which is again, one of the things I want to talk about, AR VR gaming, which is just slightly away from NFC. And Abby, I'm looking at you. We've seen the talk of VR gaming for almost like 5 years, 6 years, even more than that. And when you look at the Oculus shop, I mean, it's pretty disappointing in terms of games. What do you think is happening here? And when are we going to see AR or VR gaming maybe pick up a little more? I mean, what's standing in the way of things at the moment?
Yeah, I can speak about this generally. I think, these are all my own opinions, and obviously I could be wrong, and I don't have all the same information that one would on the inside of Facebook or any of the other ones. So I would say, there is growth in the gaming developers for VR, both in the number of developers, but also the outcomes are higher, right? They're able to, I can't remember off the top of my head, but like they are reaching higher revenue than ever before, and a bigger portion of them are reaching that revenue. So it used to be like $1 million in revenue. That was a big deal. And now it's, I think it's like over 25 million for some of them. And so I know people tend to point to Beat Saber, obviously is a very successful one, started by 2 developers, acquired for a decent, exit. And so that was, I think, it was good for morale in the industry. That being said, it's still one of very few huge successes. When I've talked to people, this is anecdotal, but the trend seems to be revealed this way, is that there's still like a headset challenge. Is just the number of headsets in the world is still so much smaller than mobile, and of course PC. But the issues are around consumers even more so. From what I have gathered, and again, don't have this data from Facebook or others, is that people use the headset a lot in the very beginning, and then they drop off and they don't use it again. And I see that that's just a very big issue, in part due to the weight of the headsets, in part due to the isolating factor, in part due to the fact that it's just there's not enough content, to your point, out there. So I'm really hesitant. I don't believe that this is going to be a huge area for a while. But I know that is, at odds with some of my friends that work at some of these companies and develop these games. But I believe there are real challenges there. I tend to maybe even agree more so with like Niantic's view of the future, which is that we don't really need to be in VR, but AR may be a better solution. That being said, Niantic, Pokemon Go is really their only big success. Like they haven't really been able to repeat that with any of their games. And to my knowledge, Pumpkin Bloom, their latest game, is not doing very well either. I don't know. Someone will correct me, I'm sure, from Niantic, but I really think that until there's like an Apple headset out there or something about for AR, that's going to be still limited. So I believe there's stuff coming. If you've ever played a VR game, it's like very compelling, or can be very, very compelling. But there's clearly some hurdles for long-term use, and the developers just reflect that.
Did anybody else have a view on AR or VR gaming? Because I mean, Elena, you might be actively investing in AR and VR companies. I mean, you may have a different view, or do you concur?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here. I mean, I think one of the challenges has been just the installed base or lack thereof on AR, VR, or more VR really. And so if I'm a investor and I'm looking at, hey, am I going to invest in a company that does mobile games versus like PC console versus VR? I mean, the numbers are very, very clear. Which platform has the biggest installed base and therefore the greatest opportunity? That being said, we're an investor in a company called Resolution Games based in Stockholm. And that business, it's focused on VR and AR game development. And that business just in the last 18 months has just taken off. So I think we're starting to finally see, well, I think we hoped to see three years ago is probably starting to happen now. We're still a long ways off from, mass market. That's my personal view, but I think there are going to be definitely some winners. We think Resolution Games is going to be one of those. But anyway, that's my thoughts.
Anybody else in that point, Elena, Minnie, on VR games, given that AR seems to be a bit more in a better place?
Abby, what about just like walking into my e-commerce experience, being able to interact with things? It's not quite a game exactly, but it's just this fluidity. Are we going to have that?
I mean, I believe so. And I think Obsess is one of the companies leading the way here. But I think I'm much more bullish on like the non-gaming uses of VR in the interim, in terms of like sustainable businesses, training and stuff like that, where we've seen you can create a real business. Like Striver has a real business doing corporate training in using VR headsets. It's the time to learn is drastically reduced. The amount of errors are reduced of doing processes using this type of technology, and AR as well. And so I think like obviously there's what I think that makes sense about that type of stuff is that you're using these headsets for a very specific and defined period of time that's like not too long, right? Most people don't spend more than like 45 minutes in a headset. Sometimes you can in some of these really engaging games, but for the most part, I believe it makes sense in the interim for like targeted experiences. You're going in there to do something very specific, like OSO VR, where you're learning medical surgical procedures. They have funding by the medical community. So like there's real market forces, and it's a very confined or defined period of time and use case. And so I just think with gaming, it's just still challenging given, the combination of factors that I mentioned before. So I do agree, like e-commerce, sure, but there's still so much friction getting headsets on and getting to like the right location, and there's not enough content out there to really like shop today in that type of space. So I still think it's quite a bit out.
Cool. I have with a few minutes left, I had two very specific questions. The first one, given advice to entrepreneurs, what traits do you look for in a founding team? And I know there are no right answers, but I'm really looking forward to seeing your expectations from founding teams. What are the traits you look for? And I have a follow-on question if we have time. Should we start with Elena? What do you look for in a founding team, and what's your advice to entrepreneurs?
Well, founding teams, first off, just people that are really passionate about whatever they're going after, and they're not leaving anything behind, and just really deep into their topics of interest, areas of interest. Obviously, the more the bigger the brain power and research or qualifications, either previous successful exits, or I don't know, spend 20 years researching, PhD in a university, the more kind of proof points of that nature, the better, obviously. And what's the advice? I guess the advice, especially if it's like an early stage, just starting off businesses, I mean, if the technology isn't just awesome, if the IP is for some reason unclear who owns it, or it's just messy, it makes for a very hard sell. But I think we talked about it. There's the saying, if you build, they will come. Even in the case where, you know, what's the analogy? Hammer looking for a nail. Even in those instances where maybe companies are just too ahead of their market, you know, early for the market case, you know, there's companies like Google and the Apples and all of those. They invest heavily on research, like 30 years ahead in areas that are really not commercializable today. Even in that case, a company that's early stage but has amazing team and technologists really ahead of its time, it can find an amazing outcome and an exit. So,
Alec, any advice and what you look for?
Yeah, I would say, you know, first and foremost, you know, track record of success is probably the number one thing. So, you know, has the founding team demonstrated success in a previous business or venture or university or whatever that is, won awards, you know, whatever metrics you use to judge that success. And then, you know, I think in terms of advice that we would give is really prove commercial momentum, right, in the business. And so first and foremost, that's KPIs, and then secondarily, that's, you know, financial momentum. So, you know, revenue, and then ultimately followed by profitability. But the other thing is really just building relationships within the ecosystem and raising the profile of the business. A lot of founding teams, and you don't want, you know, your founding team to be distracted by, you know, a whole bunch of things outside the business. But on the other hand, a lot of mergers and acquisitions is catalyzed by companies that have known each other before, you know, there's a process, right? And so, you know, getting to know not only just strategic players that either could be commercial partners or acquisition partners, but also investors, and kind of building that network and raising the profile of the business over time often would lead to a good result.
Minnie and Abby, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on the one point there, which is, you know, in today's market with the valuations where they are, we actually, you know, I think I see a big divergence between people who've had a prior exit or prior success, prior venture success. So we talk about it now as distance traveled. So a lot of what Alex said, which is distance traveled, is you've had success, like you've gone from here to here, but it doesn't necessarily need to mean in the context of having had a previous venture success, because sometimes we then get priced out, to be frank about where I sit in this ecosystem. So yeah, I look for someone who's genuine, who's had that distance traveled success. And look, I hesitate to give too much advice, because really, I'm not looking for someone who comes with a perfect venture Tam, Tom, Sam slide. I want someone who's like uniquely looks me in the eye and tells me why this is going to be huge, and has me believe that they are building something, not trying to sort of follow a formula given on a panel by a VC.
I would agree with everything that everyone said. I would add two things. One is like a bias towards action, which I think inherently you do see with people who have already started or worked at startups before. I think the challenge is when you have a founder that comes from like a corporate world, knowing whether or not they can move that quickly. and not get stuck in analysis paralysis. And then the other part I think is interesting, at least or has been helpful for us, is just understanding how good of a storyteller or a communicator that the founder is, specifically as the CEO, less the technical partner if they're separate. But one of the ways that we've evaluated that is to ask for past investor updates, just to sort of see how they communicate their strategic vision, like how they communicate what they do and how they prioritize what they're working on. That's been really helpful in sort of illuminating whether or not they have that.
And Chase, finally, what's advice for fellow entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I completely agree with what everybody said today. But I think like it coming from a perspective of a founder as well, I think one of the biggest things that sort of like changed how we moved in the NFT space between 2017 to 2021 is the fact that there were not a lot of projects that stayed on to follow through that vision of like what we thought would happen to NFTs in the early days. And so I think that level of grit and resilience should always be there, especially if you really believe in something that you really want to build. That should be the case, because there were a lot of passionate founders who's like really into the space, but it fizzled out just because obviously like there's a lot of like personal things happening there here and there as well, but a big chunk of that is that they probably didn't see that it will happen. Or didn't believe that it will happen. So I think that at some point that there has to be this level of passion, but rather also an inclusion of like how long can you stay on the saddle given the circumstances that are not really in favor of you in a period of time. So I think that's kind of like going to test you out as a founder and as an entrepreneur, and at the same time like building these relationships, being able to really tell a story about what your vision is and making it happen. I'm currently in the process of fundraising for a fund that's basically centered towards universities like Berkeley, Stanford, and Wharton, their blockchain programs in general. And it's going to be very different in terms of like who I'm going to be looking for as a founder as well, because in that particular case, these are mostly students. And so there's not a lot of background in terms of like, oh, have they had previous success? Because quite frankly, they probably doesn't have that track record. So it's going to be a different sort of like perspective in terms of like who I look for. And I guess it's like really more mirrored into like a founder's journey versus more of like an investor journey because it's I came from the other side of the fence.
Cool. All right. I think we've hit the hour. First of all, again, thank you all for your time, and thank you for being here and sharing your thoughts and opinions and advice to the gaming community. Thank you all again. And on that note, I will close the panel, and I wish you all a very, very happy Christmas, holidays, and keep gaming, because you're going to have a lot of time in your hands during this holiday period.
Thank you, Sri. I appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sri.
Take care.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.